from other places. To everyone, and many thanks for joining us both here in the event platform, but also in YouTube, where you're also following this seminar. I am Chema Vera. I'm just finishing my time with Loyola Andalucía University that is hosting this event, and it is my pleasure and my privilege to moderate this panel with leaders and friends, actually with leaders that are friends. So that's the best position that I can have. I will introduce properly each one of the participants we have and also agenda. But let me first give the floor to Carlos García to welcome all of you. Carlos is the Vice-Rector for Research of Loyola University, and he's a supporter of this institution to become a champion of sustainable development. Carlos, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. Hello, everyone, and thank you and welcome to our seminar, Setting a New Agenda for Equality and in the Wake of COVID-19. This seminar has been organized by the Institute of Development Studies and the corresponding research group of the Universidad Loyola Andalucía. This is the third seminar related to inequality because, as you probably know, we hold a first seminar on the role of universities in fighting against the inequality, and a second seminar on the determinants of inequality, specifically in Spain, and policies to face it. Today, we are very glad to welcome to our speakers, Winnie Byanyima, Executive Director for UNAIDS and Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. Gabriela Bucher, Executive Director of Oxfam, Ricardo Fuentes, Development Expert and former Executive Director of Oxfam México, and finally, our friend Chema, who is working with us this month as a visiting professor, helping us to focus our efforts and instruments in the service of development and equity. Thank you all. We were expecting to receive Mrs. Byanyima personally in our campus in Seville, but we hope to do it very soon. We are very interested in what a university like ours can do to support global efforts on social justice related to a global access to the vaccine. Development, and more specifically, the study of inequality sources and how to deal them are main concepts of our university, and it is defined in our strategic orientations. We know that the world is our home, and the study of inequalities has to be an immediate impact on our teaching and research. Working together in the global network of Jesuit universities and civil organizations, we expect to participate in addressing the challenge of inequality. We have prepared this dialogue framework to include the participation of our students, whom we try to bring closer to these issues during their studies. We trust that they will be agents of change and social justice in the future. I hope that this dialogue will be fruitful. And I said at the beginning, we are very glad in hosting this event and would wish to have fruitful results. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Carlos, and let me also thank you personally for welcoming me at Loyola. This is a great university, very strong in research, with a great team, a fantastic team, and a firm commitment to sustainability and to inclusion. So it has been a real privilege to be with you for a time.
Thanks,
So let's go for it. This is the third seminar of a series that we have organized to contribute to the debate and the alternatives to face the inequality crisis. We had one with academics focused on the role of universities. We had a second to debate about inequality in Spain, and this one where we will broaden the scope to a world where gaps are deepening during the pandemic. We will speak about COVID-19 and inequalities in vaccines distribution across the world, what this tells about access to health, and from there, we will analyze the economic impact of the pandemic in the most vulnerable.
Sorry, Chema, you are mute now. I think that Chema has lost his signal. Now. Chema, turn on your microphone.
Gives me something happened in my connect. Sorry. Let's go back. So there will be a first round of words from the participants, from Winnie, from Gabriela, and from Ricardo, followed by a dialogue with 5 of the Loyola students that will ask the participants and also dialogue with them. And finally, we will hopefully have time for any questions that may come from other participants that are here in the platform. I'm not fully sure that we have Winnie because she was having connection problems. So let me check that we have.
I'm here. I've been here.
Winnie, so good to hear you. I know we some of us we're having some problems with the connection, so it's not only you. It has also been me. Thanks for joining, Winnie. And let me open with you. Winnie is the Secretary General of UNAIDS. She has a long international career, always in the side of rights and dignity. I want to highlight her time as Executive Director of Oxfam and the many intense moments that we faced together during that time. She has been a politician in her country, Uganda, but above all, Winnie is an activist for equality and a fighter for women's rights. Winnie, the floor is yours. Thanks for yours.
Thank you, Chema. Can you hear me?
We can hear you well, and we can see you well.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much, Vice Chancellor Carlos Garcia, for this great opportunity. I'm so delighted to be here with my friends, Gabriela, Ricardo, and others. I read up about Loyola University, and I was so inspired by its mission. It said, for the creation of knowledge, for the problems and needs of today's world, and where men and women are formed to be committed to the development of a more just and sustainable society. This is a university after my own heart. I was so delighted because it is about a just and sustainable society, and that's what I'm going to speak about. We are in the second year of this COVID pandemic. It has changed our world in more ways than we can imagine, and many parts of the world, we are hurting, we are in pain. Just last night, I got the news that my first cousin, whom I grew up with, 65 years, lost the battle. 2 of my nephews are in hospital receiving oxygen. Oxygen is in short supply in my country. The hospitals run out, they are full, others can't get a bed. Vaccines are finished. People are dying every day. And some people are sitting on their technology, reaping billions of dollars as people die. It's a scandal. It is it's a crime against humanity. But this is the world we are in. That is the unequal world we are in. heartbreaking pain everywhere, and some people counting dollars like life means nothing. So as with the HIV epidemic, COVID has exposed the weaknesses in all our societies. It has widened already wide inequalities. It has sharpened vulnerabilities. It has left the world and leaders exposed. Really, the scandal of the injustice in the world today, I don't know what else could make it more vivid. The World Bank has estimated that COVID-19 has pushed at least 119 million people into extreme poverty last year. And that's last year, and it's continuing this year. We learned that 80 million children have missed out on vaccines for their lives, the vaccines we get when we are children, because health systems are at breaking point. So those are children who will suffer probably many diseases, die young. Over 1 billion children have lost out on schooling. In my country, a total lockdown was announced 2 days ago. All schools have been shut once again. So another year, probably, of out of school. Many of those may never return because the country's economies have shrunk and the ability to pay for all school children isn't there anymore. Gender-based violence has risen, it continues to rise, and UN Women cites reports of spikes of up to 40% in some countries. So the pandemic we see is disproportionately affecting poor people, low-income people, informal workers, marginalized, vulnerable populations, and amongst them, women the most, and girls. I know that you in Spain are suffering the hard impacts too, especially young people, like the ones we are going to be having a discussion with here, especially those who are looking for their first job. This has to be really hard. Or those who are in informal employment, short-term employment, in care work, these are the people most hit. I'm sure you're aware of the privilege, anyway, of having strong government, public service, public health systems like you have in Spain and across Europe with the funds to run health services. I once fell sick in Barcelona, and Chema and his group took me to the health system in Barcelona. I was treated immediately. I was not asked for money. I went away surprised. I thought I had stolen something. But there you are. You have a health service that meets the needs of everybody, rich and poor. You must feel privileged to have that. That you have the resources to protect all your citizens and you put them out for them. Poor economies don't have the economic tools, the stabilizers at their disposal, and have weak health systems. So crisis hits them very badly. No social safety nets for the weak. So these are the inequalities in the health systems within and between countries, the inequalities when crisis hits. COVID has shown us several things. I'm going to mention 5 things. First, that the health of people and the health of our economies are tightly linked. I think we will stop looking at health as a welfare issue. We have to see it more and more as an issue of our economy, of our security, that they are tied together. Secondly, what do we learn from HIV, fighting HIV? This world I have entered, as we've been fighting a pandemic for 40 years. Surely we've learned something. Here are some of the things we've learned. First, that to beat a pandemic, you have to confront the inequalities that drive it. Because when a pandemic hits, first it hits as an emergency, as a health, as an outbreak. For an outbreak to become an emergency and then become a pandemic, a global pandemic, it is riding through the cracks of inequalities. So if inequalities did not exist, an outbreak would be contained and we would never have a pandemic. But we have pandemics because they can flow and follow the path of inequalities and spread very fast. So we know that when you confront inequalities, then you stop the pandemic. This is what we have learned. When we ignore those inequalities, these outbreaks turn into pandemics that last for years and years. It's not a coincidence that many of the high HIV prevalence places in the world are those with high inequalities in wealth, in power, in status, and in access to services. It's not a coincidence that HIV rates go up when there are breakdowns in healthcare and crackdowns on people who are marginalized. Every week, my friends, 4,200 adolescent girls and young women, people between the age of 15 and 24 in sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest region, get HIV. Every week, 4,200 girls. 6 out of 7 new infections of HIV among young people, 15 to 19, 6 out of 7 are girls. Only 1 is a boy. Inequality, huge inequality. These numbers are at the root of the inequalities in power between men and women, girls and boys in society. So when we don't tackle these, we don't get to the bottom of the HIV pandemic. That's what we've learned. 2, we know that rights-based approaches are the most effective pathways to achieving public health. A human rights approach, a service client approach, a patron expert victim approach, no, doesn't work. It's a rights-based approach that delivers. In countries where same-sex relations are criminalized, men who have sex with men are over 2 times as likely to have HIV than in countries where it's not criminalized. You see, about human rights. Human rights. Through our work, we have an HIV policy lab. We see that countries that criminalize gay men, that criminalize sex workers, that criminalize people who use drugs personally, are so much less successful in achieving the targets for HIV treatment. They have the same treatment maybe, but they can't achieve the targets because the human rights of those who are affected are not there. Closing those gaps on human rights is critical. The third lesson, so governments have to challenge exclusion, structural racism, bias, discrimination, xenophobia. These are the things that widen the inequalities for certain groups of people and deny them the health that is their right. Inequalities. The third lesson is that communities must be at the center of every response, public response to a health crisis. Communities are key because those most affected must take charge of the services for themselves, for them to be served fairly and with dignity. Communities with the power to speak truth to the powerful, to hold leaders to account, is the surest way to make sure that there are positive outcomes for people. That's why for us, communities are at the heart of the work of UNAIDS. In our last meeting at the General Assembly 2 weeks ago, we had a target introduced in the political declaration by member states. We included a target to ensure that 80% of HIV prevention services for what we call key populations, the special groups that are vulnerable, are provided by communities, 80%. We'll see if governments will deliver. But we know if they do, then we will get closer to reaching the marginalized, the most unequal people in society. Fourth, health technologies. This is where my heart is bleeding today. Health technologies must be global public goods. There is no way you can privatize them and sell them like a pair of shoes or like candy. Health technologies are for saving lives and must be global public goods. A year ago, the COVID battle was around the science. Today, it is monopolies. The science has been found. But what is the issue now? Why are people dying today? It's the monopolies. The G7 met last week. And I don't want to use my own words. I use the ones of Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He said it is an unforgivable moral failure, and it was. The G7 pledge to fund 1 billion vaccines falls short of the 11 billion doses to reach global herd immunity. 1 billion, but we need 11 billion. We can't have 11 billion unless we can have more and more capable producers producing. But we can't have that because of monopolies. Today, we are talking of just 0.3% vaccines in low-income countries rolled out. Pfizer committed, this one with the precious, the golden vaccine of the vaccines. It committed months ago to give 40 million doses to COVAX, the pool for developing countries who don't have the technology. Today, they have delivered only 1.25 million doses. That's what they produce in one single day. They promised 40 million last year. They have delivered for one single day. That is where we are in the world. And yet, at least 9 people, including Pfizer people, have become new billionaires last year from the pharma industry, from these vaccines. 9 new billionaires. Oxfam has calculated, and I love Oxfam, that their total wealth could vaccinate every single person in the world's poorest countries, these handful of billionaires. So we care for the profits more than the people. 2 of the most successful vaccines are driving huge revenues, Moderna and Pfizer. They are going to be the best-selling pharmaceutical products in the world, with revenues of about 60 billion this year. I could go on, but really, the inequality there, the injustice of holding on to a life-saving technology to make 60 billion is just shocking. So, public goods, health technologies must be global public goods. We are going to continue saying this in our People's Vaccine Alliance. We will raise our voices higher. We will put the images of the dying there before the decision makers until their moral conscience is pricked. But if that doesn't prick them, even the economic nonsense of it is also there. The World International Chamber of Commerce estimated that the loss to the whole global economy of partial shutdowns of economies is $9 trillion. More than half of it to the rich countries themselves. So if they don't care about life, they ought to care about jobs and their money, but they have to see the economic sense too. We will continue putting the lives of people there through our campaigning. We are calling for putting the technology in the WHO Covid19 technology access pool. This is not giving it away for free. It's about sharing it under given terms, but so that manufacturing in other regions is multiplied. And then we move quickly to herd immunity all across the world. We are arguing also, calling for money to be put down for the developing countries to be able to afford. Today, even if you put down the money, the vaccines are not there. But if the vaccines are there, already stretched health systems in many countries, they can't afford. Right down in my country, as I've told you, there's even no oxygen, no PPEs. Health workers are collapsing, can't cope with the burden. So there's money that's needed for countries in the form of debt relief, in the form of ODA. We saw one of the G7 countries cut ODA in the middle of a crisis. It is shocking. But ODA is needed to be maintained or stepped up to 0.7. Debt relief that is meaningful. The IMF special drawing rights to be shared better amongst the developing countries more. These are things we are arguing about and saying they are not just charity. They are global solidarity and they are economic sense. Lastly, we need to organize, and I've talked to it, financing for health, in line with the recognition that health can only be realized collectively through public taxation. So addressing global corporate tax justice. This is an agenda that Oxfam has worked on for so many years, including Oxfam Intermon, the special Oxfam Intermon. I won't say much here, but the recent progress that was announced by the G7 to have a minimum corporate tax is a good beginning, but it is small. We want something more ambitious in terms of a minimum global corporate tax and more closing of tax loopholes so that developing countries can raise the money they need. All countries can raise the money they need to pay for public services. We don't have them, not because there's no money, but because the rich opt out of taxation because politicians allow them. I want to stop there. I've touched on many points that some of you are experts on and can amplify further. I thank you for this opportunity, Chema, and hand back to you.
Thanks a lot, Winnie. One of the bad things of screens is that we can't clap at the same time, so you're losing warmth on that. So sorry to hear about your cousin and about your nephews, and we all hope that the two of them will recover well. Thanks a lot for your inspiring, as always, inputs, and let us continue with Gabriela. Hello, Gabriela. Hola, Gabriela. Buenas tardes. Gabriela is the Executive Director of Oxfam International now, probably one of the most exciting positions in the world, and definitely for someone like you, a champion of feminist leadership, someone that fights for the rights of people in front of oppression and exclusion. She's Colombian, from Cali, a city of activism and struggle, very especially during these past weeks. Thanks for joining us. Gabriela, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Chema, y gracias a la Universidad de Loyola en Andalucía for all the work you're doing to put this pandemic and academic firepower behind the fight against inequality. And I'm really pleased to hear Winnie today. She so wonderfully highlighted what we face today. And of course, we have this tradition of Winnie having led Oxfam for many, many years, and Chema as well. So I stand on the shoulders of giants as I go into this journey of leading Oxfam over the last few months. So first, I wanted to give a snapshot of what we have called an inequality virus that we've seen. And some of the data is that Oxfam sees from the survey of leading economists that we risk seeing the highest rise in inequality in almost every single country on the planet at once. And this is the highest since records began. Second, it could take over a decade for the world's poorest people to recover from the economic impacts of the pandemic. And that's the story at the bottom. And third, the 1,000 richest billionaires on the planet recovered their COVID-19 losses within just 9 months. And that's the story at the top. And as Winnie was saying a moment ago, even the 10 billionaires, the highest billionaires in the planet, could have enough from what their profits of the first 9 months of the pandemic to vaccinate the world and even to prevent anybody from slipping into poverty. So that's the scale of the difference that we are seeing. So inequality really defines the pandemic, and something that I feel very strongly is the issue on the global food system. So we know there's 142 million people who are forecast to be in acute food and livelihood crisis this year. A figure which has been going up, unfortunately, since in 2016, so 56% up since 2016. And the UN Secretary General has a global appeal of 5.5 billion to avert famine. At the same time, the profits at the world's largest food and beverage companies have been going up sky high. And last year, the 8 largest companies paid out over 18 billion to their shareholders. And again, another huge contrast. 5.5 billion is the UN Secretary General's fund to avert famine. And then at the other end, we have 18 billion paid to shareholders. We also must be very intersectional in our analysis of this inequality. So the pandemic shows how economic, racial, and gender inequalities collide in the reality of people's lives. So we saw in Brazil how people of Afro descendants are 40% more likely to die of COVID-19 than white people. And that is a trend we see across the world. Also, we reported recently how COVID-19 cost women at least 800 billion in lost income in 2020. And that's more than the combined GDP of 98 countries. So women are being hard hit by the pandemic in many different ways, and women from marginalized ethnic and racial groups even more. So when we talk about the gap between rich and poor, we must be clear about how it's also intimately connected to white supremacy and to the patriarchy. So for us, it's also very clear as we look across the world that our failure to address these inequalities has left the world feeling like a tinderbox, ready to be lit. And this leads me to my second point. What will be our role to play in all of this? We saw before the pandemic protests against inequality across the globe. And today, people are again showing that anger for multiple reasons rooted in inequality. And as Chema was saying a moment ago, it's clear in Colombia and very centered in Cali in Colombia. We also see it in Senegal in the last few days, in many other countries. And it's a bit, and it will be interesting to discuss with the students today. There's a lot of youth involvement in these protests and questions about what they see as their future. But rather than we can no longer think of this as something to worry. You know, we just have to think, what action are we going to take now? Because we really need to go into disruptive change led by movements like Black Lives Matter, which has really been very transformative of the last year, or Ni Una Menos in Latin America, or climate strikers, all this social justice that is on the streets. And people really want change. We hear from people being polled in 27 different countries, 86% of people wanted to see the world change significantly to become more equal. So they don't want the old normal back. In Colombia, for example, there's a lot of disruption and people are being affected by the strikes and the protests, but the majority of people support it because they know they're talking about a big change. So governments the world over face a stark choice in how they respond to this. They can continue to promise lip service to inequality and continue the old unjust neoliberal way, or they can double down and really work on this problem. So I think our role as civil society and as academia is to make society make the right choices, to build knowledge, and to expand the imagination of the possible. And it will be good to explore that together today, to exert pressure to help movements win. And universities like yours, as universities did so in the past, have a huge role to play in the fight for equality. And I deliberately keep using the word equality. When people think about equality, it's often seen as something for idealists or an inconvenience to capitalism. So we want to challenge and say, no, actually, equality is a moral and serious and fresh framework that can reshape the way we run our economies this century. And this pandemic is pushing us to really think differently. So what is it that we're actually pushing for? Equality. So let's vocalize an exciting vision for equality, centered on ending extreme economic inequality and ending racial and gender inequality altogether. So we need real goals, not just more leaders lamenting inequality. We need every country to set time-bound and concrete targets and plans to reduce inequality. And we also need transformational policies. Is there a more common sense economic solution than ending vaccine monopolies on COVID vaccines, as Winnie was explaining earlier? Be it universal healthcare and education, universal social protection, and a global fund for social protection, which we advocate for. They must be the legacies of the pandemic. And going to taxes, the fiscal space exists to pay for this with some imagination. So let's focus on tax. If we are to reduce inequality, we need to tax wealth and capital far more effectively. And with the huge rise in billionaire wealth during the pandemic, there is a strong case for a windfall tax on billionaire wealth too. And I end by saying, let's understand our job as systems change and connect the issues, such as the links between inequality, rising monopoly power, and democracy, or about how climate catastrophe is being supercharged by inequality. The emissions of the 1% are double that of the bottom 50%. So they're going to have to tackle this carbon inequality together with the relentless pursuit of GDP growth if we're going to stand a change of getting to a more equal world. So thank you, and looking forward to discussion.
Thank you, Gabriela. Thanks a lot, and thanks for leading Oxfam as a power force in this struggle to fight extreme inequality, with many data and many facts, but also with these that you have highlighted of it being a moral framework and setting also inspiring visions for equality. So thanks for sharing with us. And now let's finish this first round with Ricardo Fuentes. Ricardo is also a very good friend. He's an expert devoted to inequality research and policy, and has always been contributing with brilliant ideas and very good analysis. He is the former director of Oxfam México and author of some of the most influential reports of Oxfam, and not only of Oxfam, on income and wealth inequality. As also Gabriela and Winnie, Ricardo is above all an activist. Thanks for joining, colleague, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chema, Fundación ET, and Universidad Loyola for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's very difficult to follow up on Winnie and Gabriela, so it's a tough job, but I'll try to kind of like complement what both Winnie and Gabriela have said with thinking about like what's ahead in terms of solutions. You know, Winnie and Gabriela have set out the problem. What we've seen with COVID is that like the inequalities were deeper and more invisible, but yet stronger than we thought. We saw a lot. We saw like that between the 85 and 10 rich people in the world control as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. We knew that. We were seeing that. We were seeing every day the extent of gender-based violence or gender inequalities in the economy. We were seeing that, but I mean, for me, the most shocking part is that we were seeing only the superficial elements of inequality, and COVID exposed like what was underneath. And what we've seen underneath is that like whenever we have a shock, a global shock that affects every single society in the world, the first who suffer are the poorest. They're like the marginalized. They're marginalized in the economy. They're marginalized in the health services. They're marginalized in the education of their children. They're marginalized in the recovery. They're marginalized everywhere in access to vaccination. So Winnie and Gabriela have mentioned all this. But then what do we do? And we need to rebuild our world in a much better place, in a much better way. And what are the, I mean, and for me, you know, to start kind of thinking, how do we need to rebuild this? We need to start recognizing what the problems are. So we know there's a problem of inequality, marginalization, poverty, exclusion, racism, classism. And we've seen societies waking up to that. We've seen it in rich countries alike, and poor countries alike. And that's important. We need to, I mean, like the moment that we're living in history, it's important to recognize that that fight for justice and equality is gaining ground. And many of you, like especially the students, are too young to know this, but like 20 years ago, when I started working on these issues, talking about inequality was not allowed. It was like you were marginalized even if you started talking about it. I used to work at the Inter-American Development Bank in the late 90s, and you know, people would say in the Washington policy circles, you have to talk about poverty and you have to talk about growth because that's what's good for the poor. You like, I mean, if you talk about inequality, you're talking about the politics of envy. You're talking about, like, I mean, you know, like something that's not relevant for the welfare of the poorest. And that has changed, and that's a big recognition, and that's a big step forward. But that's not enough. We need to build societies and international community in a much better way. And what does that mean? On that, like, I'm not always too optimistic because we've seen like the rise of right-wing populism around the world, and like that's worrying in itself. But like, I mean, for me, the most worrying thing is what's beneath the rise of right-wing populism, which is the lack of trust in authorities and institutions. Authorities and institutions that have committed lots of mistakes and like sometimes are built on the wrong premise, but that at the same time have ensured progress and peace in general. So we're facing this tough option. You know, we need to make these institutions better. We need to make our governments more accountable, but we cannot just ignore what we built either. And I think that's, I mean, for me, that's the biggest challenge. How do we find that balance so that we don't throw our societies into the hands of right-wing politicians who will destroy like everything we've been fighting for and building over time, and at the same time demand a much better social contract. That social contract, we've seen a lot of discussions about like the need of a new social contract. What does that mean? You know, a contract has two parts. I mean, a contract for a contract to work, you need two agents. And in a social contract, what you have is on one side the state, on the other side citizens, and we both have responsibilities on that contract. And we both, and like it's an exchange. And what I mean, for that contract to work, we need to trust each other. And for that trust to be built, we need to have that conversation of what we want as societies. And what we want as societies, we've seen it, we know it is a more just, more equal. And we need to adapt like all those systems so that we can make them work for everyone and not just for the privileged few. That's one of the big tasks we have ahead. The task of rebuilding our institutions in a way that like they're inclusive, that they actually kind of provide the services, protections, and rights to the most marginalized groups in societies. And we have to rebuild our international cooperation system. As Winnie was saying, it's a scandal that we have the vaccines and then people are not getting vaccinated in low-income countries. It is a scandal because, like, as it has been repeated constantly, you know, no one will be safe until everyone's safe. But it's a scandal because we have the resources and the technology and the science. How do we do that? We do that through engagement. We'll do that through questioning, but we'll also do through compromise. I'm very worried, you know, in a way, you know, by the idea that, like, I mean, we cannot compromise right now. But like, I mean, my sense is like, or what I'm trying to say is, yeah, we need to demand, but we need to build together. We cannot build separately. We cannot just like accept that we're part of our own communities or of one identity, instead of like identifying that we belong to different like groups at the same time, and that we like, and for us to work together as societies, that we need to recognize the others, and we need to recognize their needs, and we need to recognize that we need to build together. And I think that's where the conversation needs to go. I think that's the kind of conversation we haven't had the chance to explore. How do we rebuild together in a way that it's been rebuilt in the past? You know, maybe not perfectly, but in the past we've seen the big jumps to more just, more equal societies, as we've seen, you know, in the U.S. after the Great Depression and the policies of the New Deal, or when we've seen in the aftermath of the Second World War with the advent of massive welfare states that are still protecting some societies from pandemics. Was it perfect? No, it wasn't. Did it leave many groups behind? Yes, they did. But we need to take what was good from that and make it even better. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much. My question for you would be, you know, like how do we have that conversation? How do we build that? How do we actually kind of construct instead of just like be angry about it? Anger is right, you know. We have a reason to be angry. Like there's a reason that like all this is happening, and it's a good reason. But we have to put that anger to constructive into constructive energy. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo. Thanks a lot. We were talking about inspiring vision for equality. You were talking about the social contract to rebuild and how to build proposals from this anger that we many times feel. Let's go ahead and see with the questions coming, with the dialogue with students, how some of these proposals may be emerging more. Let me say to those of you that are in the WebEx platform that you can also post questions. Let's see, we also have time for that, but we will try. We will do our best. And unfortunately, this is not available for those of you that are following the seminar in YouTube. So let's go for the dialogue with some of Loyola Andalucía students. There are some questions for you, friends. And let's start with Teresa Paniagua, a student of 4th year of international relations, that in the future she would like to dedicate to international business, and very interested on foreign trade. And I think there is a first question for you, Winnie. We will have questions for each one of you, and then maybe a couple of general questions. Let's make it short and as a dialogue to allow for several questions to come. So, Teresa, questions yours.
Okay, thank you, Chema. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for your words. I believe that this meeting is really enriching. And I would like to ask Winnie, and my question is related to the 4th point that you mentioned, that health technology must be public. We are now in a new cycle for the pharmaceutical industry, and many leaders of global organizations have taken a position on the issue of patent liberalization. So this is clear that this development of vaccines has been a great step forward in science, but it is worth asking, I ask myself, whether governance has been up to the task of science throughout this time of pandemic. So my question is related to if you are hopeful about patent liberalization and what that entails in terms of industrial and logistical needs to make it effective. Do you think that it can be a solution for closing the gaps between people, as you said in your works? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Winnie.
Thank you, Teresa. I hope I've understood your question. But see what has happened. This pandemic has hit the whole world, and for the first time, every country all over the world needed a vaccine or a cure. So we're all in the same place needing the same product. Governments of rich countries pulled their money, put money into different companies, up to $100 billion, to get the companies to race towards finding either a cure or a vaccine. And lo and behold, we got a vaccine in less than a year. That is really outstanding. It's a huge achievement. But the same governments who put their money into these private companies are sitting back and not asking those same companies to license out others so that there is enough production for the whole world. It beats understanding, because this is not a question of giving away what they have. We need them to share the technology so that there is more production all over the world. So you ask about the TRIPS waiver. The waiver is important, and they have made arguments that no, but even if you make a waiver for a vaccine, it doesn't make any difference because there are many stages in the process of making the vaccine. Without the technology and the know-how, the waiver of a patent for the whole vaccine isn't useful. That may be true, but we need the waiver, but we also need the technology and the know-how. We need both. It's not either or, but the argument they have tried to make is that the waiver is not enough. Yes, we know it's not enough, but it is essential. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need the waiver because if another country tries to repeat the technology and learn and build it, it can be sued without this waiver. So we need the waiver so that it encourages more repetition and learning and reproducing of vaccines. So that's one. But we also need the technology and know-how to be shared, and there is no wheel to reinvent here. During the HIV pandemic, something called a medicines patent pool was created at WHO. A medicines patent pool was used to pool technology, know-how, so that it can be shared globally. So the model of the setup is modeled on the medicines patent pool. It's a methodology that has been tested of how to put your technology there, continue benefiting from it, but be able to replicate it and achieve mass production at scale. So sharing technology and know-how is part of the solution. A TRIPS waiver is part of the solution. When we see who is now standing in the way of a TRIPS waiver, we see it is the countries who host the companies that are holding the technology and the know-how and the patents. It is those companies. The rest of the world is coming together. America has now said they are backing the waiver, but we're yet to see them actually talk about also sharing the technology and the know-how. We're pushing them in that direction. France has also said the same, but then they are trying to water down the resolution before WTO proposed by South Africa and India, and trying to narrow it to a small range of patents. But we are saying it should be about the vaccines, it should be about treatments that may come, a cure that may come. It's about the whole range of health technologies. That's so important. And we want it to be a fundamental change in the global rules of trade so that in future, we always have the opportunity to benefit from life-saving technologies. We don't want it to be limited just to COVID. We want a restructuring of global rules around health technologies. It was wrong in the first instance to trade health technologies the way you trade luxury goods. They're not the same. So I hope I've answered your question. So our demand on this in this area is that a TRIPS waiver must be there, because that will give every country the opportunity to explore, innovate, copy and produce technology and produce the vaccine quickly. Secondly, we need the technology and know-how shared through well-established procedures that have worked before for sharing.
Thank you,
Chema.
Thank you, Winnie. Extremely clear. And thank you, Teresa. We will move now to Ignacio Garijo, who is also in the 4th course, in this case of Economics and International Relations. He says that multidisciplinary learning is a never-ending process that is key for him to have a positive impact in the world. And he has a question for Gabriela, I think. So Ignacio, your turn.
Hello, thank you very much. My question is true that it is for Gabriela, but I think that all of you have spoken a little bit about this topic. So after decades of austerity and privatization policies imposed all around the globe by, for example, the Consensus of Washington or some international organizations, some have argued that the response to the economic consequences of the COVID-19 crisis have been different than the response to previous economic crises. So my question is, are we witnessing a change in the economic paradigm? Is inequality and poverty and how to tackle them or reduce them a growing concern for global leaders and international institutions? Or has it not really changed?
Thank you, Ignacio. And yes, I have the same question, and I suppose it can go in different directions, and I think we're all learning, but I am optimistic. On the one hand, I think, as Ricardo was saying earlier, this narrative of inequality has gradually been understood deeply, and so the IMF, World Bank, everybody's talking about in these terms, no longer talking only of poverty reduction, but we still have only poverty reduction targets. So we need to come into inequality reduction targets because we're talking about changing the system. So I do believe there's a moment of reckoning where we are looking at the possibility of really changing the model because of the crisis of inequality, because it's unsustainable, and because we are clearly noticing that we're reaching our planetary limits as well. And the narrative of growth, as growth being the answer to poverty reduction, it doesn't add up anymore, because unlimited growth in a limited planet, of course, is not possible. And this pandemic and the climate crisis are connected. And we also expect, unfortunately, more pandemics and more challenges with the climate crisis. So I believe there is a change in the thinking, and we have heard that from very high officials at both at the financial institutions. Austerity has been proven to really create too much pain and too much, and in fact is counterproductive even for good economic performance. Whereas the moments when there's been stimulus and investment, as there has been in this last year in those countries that were able to afford it, then there is a possibility of redistribution and a possibility of reducing inequality. And again, as Ricardo was mentioning, there's this possibility to address this in a way that the post-Second World War moment was addressed, is to understand we're in a deep crisis that requires us to act differently. And at the time, for example, taxation went up to 40 to 50% for corporates, and that was accepted and for many years continued. But it was a change of thinking in the 80s that where neoliberal thinking started believing in this trickle-down economics, where it was better to let companies have their profits to reinvest and generate jobs. That has been the dominant belief in many of economies, which is really now come to its limits, where we see CEO pay has been skyrocketing, shareholder pay has been skyrocketing, while at the same time workers' pay has at best become stagnant. But I think in many cases we know that the precariousness of work has become really unacceptable. So it's undignified work, and this is what people are protesting about. So people who work hard do not have enough to have a dignified life. And it's no longer a possibility to continue extracting in the way it has been extracted. And this is what is launching the new thinking. And I think this also is affecting the way countries behave between each other. So the vaccine issue is again a deep inequality between countries, which is not only a moral imperative and a health imperative, as Winnie was saying, but also it's an economic one. So the countries that will take 3 to 4 years to receive vaccines will not have the chance to recover economically, such as the ones that have already vaccinated their whole populations and are even vaccinating children. So the more they're stopped, the more they will have, you know, the effects of the economic crisis, and that will not only affect them, it will affect the whole economic system. So there is also an enlightened solidarity, so to say, because global supply chains will be too affected for growth to happen even in the rich developed world. So that would also, but the deep change really, which is the crisis, the acute crisis at the moment is the pandemic, but the deep crisis that we're all living through is a climate crisis. And this is the one that is making us have different targets and to start thinking differently around this issue of growth. And that's going to be a big challenge now. So it's very uncomfortable to suddenly think it's more about distributing, a lot more about distributing than about growing.
Thanks a lot, Gabriela, for touching this extremely important time of growth, the point of growth and what it means for companies, countries, states, organizations, and even for individuals. I mean, it's a personal thing. It finally ends up with us. Let's continue this dialogue. It's very interesting. I think it's building up with some key issues and also emerging proposals for how to face the extreme inequality crisis, and move to Jesus de la Torre, who is studying currently mastering European Union, and he wants to work for a world where no one is treated differently because of her origin, country, or ascendance. So he's very much interested on the migration issue that you know well, Winnie and friends, that I also share a lot. So I think, Jesus, you also have a question in this case for Ricardo, I think.
Thank you so much, Chema. My question is for Ricardo, and in fact, Ricardo, you have said we need to recognize the others. And I would like to talk about migrants who, at the worst moments of the pandemic, were at the front line, working in agriculture, health sectors, logistics, and we now see that they have been excluded from vaccination campaigns, or even they have been deported. And my question is, how current migration policies are affecting these migrants and migrants on the move? And in general, how could we tackle inequalities between migrants from the global north and the global south after this pandemic moment? Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. I'm not a migrant expert, and so maybe, you know, most of the things I'm going to say, they're going to be quite shallow. But I mean, the center of the migration problem is the uneven development processes around the world, and the fact that we in many ways we decide that, like, living in a country is way more important, like living in a country and protecting that way of living in a country is way more important than solidarity with other people. So I think that, like, I mean, the main question is, like, I mean, or the reason, like, the way to, how can we manage that flow in a way in which we can still protect and provide, you know, the opportunities to those who are in need, while at the same time kind of like, because we're still organized as nation states, and like we're organized as nation states within the context of like social contract in one way or another, you know, like, I mean, so, and that social contract implies, you know, that we pay taxes and that then they provide services and things like that. And we haven't yet thought, you know, what that social contract means, you know, if we're to manage better migrant flows. What do we expect from one side? What do we retribute on the other side? What's the role of international community? And I think that's one of the big failures of international, like the international development community, because like we leave that to, you know, for every single country to respond. And then that changes when leadership changes. You know, we saw it when Donald Trump got elected in the U.S. Like the U.S. migration policy has not been very good for decades, but it became way worse. It became inhumane. It became like cruel when a man like Donald Trump got elected. And that, I mean, for me, like, I mean, the fact that like our migration kind of responses can fluctuate like that shows a lack of leadership, you know, from the international community, because we haven't got, I know there are like two compacts, one for refugees, one for migration. That was a big step, you know, was signed a couple of years ago, and like that was a massive step forward. But like, I mean, if we don't treat this as a systemic issue, as a global issue, where we have like minimum standards and financing for that, it's gonna be piecemeal. It's gonna be like, I mean, in some instances inefficient, and it's in worst case scenarios, it's going to be cruel and inhumane. And I think those are the kind of things, you know, we need to start asking. Like, I mean, migration, because of the international nature of international migration, it needs a systemic international response, and we haven't seen that. Sorry?
Put in the chat. Chema?
Yes, Winnie, please.
Can a panelist ask a question?
Of course, this is a dialogue.
My question is to you. Because as I listened to the last question.
Oh, you can't ask a question.
Okay, my question is to the students too. As I was listening to the answer by Ricardo and the question by the young man, I thought about what I saw recently. And I wanted to hear from you, Chema, from your heart and from the students, and what you thought. I saw Morocco opening its gates and allowing people to run across into Spain. And it seemed to be an action that the Moroccans were doing in retaliation for what they thought was Europe or Spain offering help to people of Western Sahara, and then punishing them by opening, because they were showing Spain that, okay, we have been doing your migration policy, keeping migrants away. Now we're going to show you. Using migration as a tool to manage its foreign policy issues, you know, instrumentalizing people like that. And I just wanted to hear your own thoughts about this.
Well, thanks, Winnie. I will say a couple of things. I mean, you know that I've been volunteering in the other African city of Spain, that is Melilla, and Ceuta. I also know it quite well, and I think this moment shows what is a rigged European migration system and how control over higher fences and walls doesn't work. But it definitely shows how people can be instrumentalized by oppressive regimes, as the Moroccan one that doesn't care about throwing its most vulnerable people to the sea. Some of them died there, others were injured, and they are continuously using it, as you say, for foreign policy and a momentum in international relations with Spain. It should be the other way around. It should be people first. And this is probably the best way of showing how unequal can be when people are used just to be thrown on the one side and be controlled and kept out, even breaking Geneva conventions in terms of refouling. So yeah, it's a very good signal. I think it has been good to highlight it here because it's one of the worst ways of showing the extreme inequalities in real places as the shores of Ceuta. But maybe some of the students, Jesus or any other, want to say something more about this in the framework of the debate we're having.
Maybe Nerea would like to contribute.
Nerea?
Well, I will just add that we cannot keep thinking that making negotiations with dictatorships is ever going to work, that they are ever going to match democratic values. And we cannot be surprised if we already know who are we giving money to.
That's a very important thing. But I will not ask Winnie to answer what she thinks about this part. Thank you. Thanks, Winnie. Thanks. Nerea, let's move a bit because I want also to link the two final questions from you, colleagues. So Diego, you have one question for whoever I think is a bit more open. Diego is studying fourth year of international relations and business admin and motivated for multilateralism. So Diego, your turn.
So yeah, this is a question open for everyone. And do you believe that in times of crisis such as the pandemic, organizations should provide countries, especially those that are more devastated, with payments to avoid postponing recovery? Do you think that developing countries therefore require new funding instruments from global funding agencies in this type of pandemic, in this time of pandemic, or could it be beneficial for developing countries not only to be able to purchase the vaccines, but also to invest in education or digitalization with this aid? Thank you.
Thank you, Diego. Maybe, I don't know if Gabriela or Ricardo, you want to come with this one?
Yes, so I would say, well, maybe I start and Ricardo or Winnie want to add as well, and others in the conversation. But yes, I agree that, and this has been something that Oxfam has been advocating strongly for, is the issuance of special drawing rights. So the ability to access more funding, which is, of course, once it is allowed by the IMF, benefits all countries, but that allocation allows least developed countries to have some greater fiscal space. There's also the issue of canceling debt payments during the time of the pandemic, which is fundamental. We also would like to push further because some of the countries, of course, are in a very critical situation in terms of being able to do the minimum required to assure health and of course education to their population. So these are the minimums, and a lot more would be required, and which is why we support the call from Olivier de Schuster, the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, to create a global fund for social security, because we need to have the minimum. It's again, think of us in a different light about what is correct for us as humanity to have, to be moral. So it's not morally right that we have a situation in which people are in such extreme situations that they're dying of hunger and of the most basic needs unmet. So there are different levels of this, from the practical and some that have already been taken, such as SDR issuance and debt payment cancellation during the pandemic, to others that really would bring us to much greater fiscal space for the countries to be able to invest. And we also at Oxfam, and that's been instituted for some time, but we're working with a group of countries that are precisely leading ahead with progressive policies to reduce inequalities. So they are showing how you can do it, even in very constrained spaces like Sierra Leone, for example, that doesn't have enormous resources, but how they are seeking to raise more taxes in the context of Sierra Leone, and then investing, for example, in having free secondary education, which is a pathway towards development in that context. We have many contexts in which we see policies that have really been transformational. Or Costa Rica, for example, in a decade achieving universal healthcare for the whole population. So it can be done in the context of a low-income country or middle-income country, and it's models that we believe can be applied to different contexts. Once you do need to have the investment necessary for that. But maybe others would like to come in. Yeah.
Ricardo, Winnie, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I think this crisis has also touched the fact that our global governance is malfunctional, is not working. Because in the past, it has been possible in situations of crisis to mobilize the world to come together to solve a global problem with a global solution. What we've seen instead is just nationalism, inward lookingness, countries trying to find a national solution to a global pandemic. So when you look at the issue of the resources needed to solve this problem, you see that the world has come together, the international community has tried, but the response has been too little, too shallow, too late. The countries that need it are not getting what they need. And the countries that are rich are lifting themselves up very, very fast. I think we have a figure of about $17 trillion that has been put into the recovery of the rich countries. Trillion, not billion, $17 trillion. On the other hand, at the international level, they came together and agreed after very, very long discussions to increase the fiscal space through what they call the special drawing rights. And they put down 650 billion, not a trillion, 650 billion. But of that, only about 22%. No, did I say 22? Only about 3.3% is going to the developing countries who need it most. 22 billion of the 650 billion. Only 22 is going to the countries that need it the most. So you see that that amount is even less than the debt repayments they have to transfer to the North externally. So what they are getting doesn't even replace what they have to give back. So you see, again, contradictions. They expand, they invest more into their economies to get out of a crisis, the rich countries, but the poor countries continue to take out with nothing to invest, and they must pay out. At the same time, the only way to do that is to shrink services, to reprioritize, to, as we are seeing in the developing countries now, that they are unable to keep all the public services out there because of this crisis. The choice between fighting the pandemic is other services, other health services, education service, social protection are suffering. So you see that it's again a kind of a double standards. We stimulate our economies, you shrink yours. That seems to be the message. But by and large, I think it's multilateralism failing. The sense of global solidarity is not as strong as it was in the past. I don't want to depress you young people, but I want you to understand the issue of power here. the reason we are here is that global governance there's so much tension. Ricardo talked about building together. Ricardo talked about trust in institutions. There's little trust in the global institutions which exist today because they were constructed a long time ago following the end of the Second World War. And those who had won the war assumed a lot of power in those institutions. Those who were born later, like my country was born after I was born. I'm older than my own country. I was born a British subject. So the newer countries and those which lost the Second World War have less power in this global system. So it doesn't work. So it cannot build the global solidarity. The new emerging economies feel less powerful. The older powerful ones are even less economically powerful and technologically powerful. So power has shifted, but the political power is not shared evenly. The inclusiveness is not there in the institutions, and it's more about governments. We, the people, the civil society, don't have a say. The private sector has brought its way in and has more and more say. So a company has a bigger say than billions of people. So the global multilateral system isn't functional, and that is a big reason why we are here. So building back, building together, building trust means claiming people's power in the global institutions, reforming them. I will stop there and give it back to Chema. We have the power and we must use it to reshape global systems.
Thank you, Winnie. And I see Gabriela, and we could talk for long. But let me give it to Nerea. That was the last question, and then we will have a final round of you three where you can add to whatever you considering in what has been said. But let me give it to Nerea for a final that is a bit more personal question. I would say, as far as she told me. So Nerea La Rinaga, that has just finished international relations and comms and focus on research and the impact of politics and comms in our societies. Nerea, the final round for you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for all your speeches. It has been so interesting. Gabriela and Winnie, you are both leaders of two of the largest organizations in the world, responsible of thousands of employees and the care of millions of people. So what is the model of leadership you adopt in this context? What are the main difficulties you have faced while leading this organization? And last but not least, how to guarantee the accession of more women to these leadership positions?
Thank you, Nerea. I will add Ricardo too, so also prepare for this. He has been leading also a very big organization, as Oxfam México. So let's have a final round of the three in this leadership style to fight inequalities across the world, but also inside our own places, our own spaces. Gabriela, maybe you can come first. You were also wanting.
I'll come first, although I think Winnie has been doing it for longer, so I'd like to hear from her as well. But anyway, what I'd say from my bit is I think we're in a constant learning process, and I think we espouse what we call feminist principles. So what does it mean? It's about doing this as a collective. So that's different from focusing on much of the individual leader who has the answers and who is very, in the top of a hierarchy that is meant to come up with all the solutions. So it's more of team working, listening, bringing in different perspectives. Diversity is, I think, key for us to see problems from many different dimensions. So not to be limited by our own limitations. And I would say, because we have to say very quickly here, my main point is work on myself, to be conscious of all the unlearning I should do on myself, and that what I do with my own being authentic and being a person who can be open to feedback, to criticism, to change, helps my organization also be open to change and to learning and to being responsive. So I think there's a certain role to play in being in a certain way, but I think this would be something for us to speak for a long time, but it's a very good question and one that we probably explore every day as we interact.
Thank you, Gabriela. I would like to hear Ricardo too on this very important topic, and then we will close with Winnie. Ricardo.
Of course. Just very briefly, I think what has worked for me is to recognize the mission of the organization I'm working for and put myself to the service of that mission, including the safeguarding and protecting of the people who work in the organization and the people we work for in that mission. I mean, for me, that's a key question. Just like, I mean, because you identify something that's bigger than yourself, bigger than the position you hold, bigger than the money you get paid, bigger than kind of like the status and recognition that comes with these positions. Like, I mean, because you're like, I mean, when you're in a leadership position, you're in that leadership position because you can put yourself to the service of the mission. Otherwise, you know, like it's very hard to make it work. You know, it's very hard to think that you know, like I don't know, like, I mean, I don't know what Gabriela or Winnie will think about this, you know, but they're very lonely, and in many occasions they're very ungrateful positions. You know, like being a leader is not always that fun. But like what makes it work is, you know, to recognize that you're doing it for something that's way more bigger than you, way bigger than you, and way more important than what you can accomplish alone. And I think that's like, I mean, that recognition and that frame of mind helped me.
Thank you, Ricardo. I fully agree with you. Sometimes it's tough. Let's go final word for Winnie, and then we will close with Pedro Caldentey of Loyola University. So allow us, stay with us for 5 minutes more. But before that, Winnie, on this.
Well, I have so little to add. I agree with Gabriela and I agree with Ricardo. I think that we have to really keep our eye on the vision of the change we want to make, the vision of the world we want, and then to understand that the change to reach that starts with myself. It's not about getting others to change. It's about me and holding myself against that vision of the world I want, and being very self-reflective and knowing that, yeah, you ask yourself a lot, but you also understand that it's about moving together with others to achieve something. There's nothing you are going to achieve on your own. To me, those are fundamentals. What Ricardo called mission, probably I would put vision. It's really what it is, what the just world that we want, and having clarity about what's achievable. And then the collective, the feminist approach, the self-reflection, the personal accountability, and starting with yourself. This is for me what it is about, that the world must come to leadership models, that we must reject the model of a leader being that strong man there who knows everything, who decides, who is never wrong, never says sorry, who doesn't cry. You know, those are notions of leadership that we must reject, and then build the empathetic, collective, listening, humble. And that is what can build a better future. Thank you, Chema. The question was such a good one to end on. Thank you for asking it.
It was a good one. Definitely, yes. And unfortunately, friends, we've come to an end. We could stay for hours. I think I was missing you. and I was missing learning from you. I've learned so much across years, and so I think it has been a short spot of more learning and sharing with you colleagues. Thanks, many thanks from my side. Let me give the final and closing words to Pedro Caldente. We have been organizing this series of seminars together, and he's the director of the economics department and the force behind the push at Loyola University to work on inequalities. So Pedro, thank you. Thanks for this space, and closing remarks from you.
Thank you, Chema. Let me finish with a few words because we are short of time. Some thank yous and some inspirations collecting from your participation. We are deeply honored to have you here discussing such an important issue from so many perspectives. Many thanks to Winnie Byanyima. We are very honored to have you here. Thank you for making time for joining us. We hope to invite you again to visit personally our campus, our cities, our people. Thank you very much also, Gabriela and Ricardo, for your participation. We followed your work before the seminar, and we will do it even with more interest in the future. Thank you, Teresa, Nerea, Jesus, Diego, and Ignacio. We appreciate very much your presence today in this dialogue. As you know, we have an unlimited trust on your ability to become agents of global change in the future. And finally, let me take this opportunity to make a global thank you to Chema, because personally I've done it many times in these days, for joining us during these months and help us in the reflection what we have to do and what is our role in the analysis and fight against inequality. We have learned many things in these seminars, in these 3 seminars. First, that the inequality, inclusive development will be a key issue to build together a better future for all of us after pandemic, to be part of this conversation that Ricardo mentions. That inequality is a global problem with many dimensions, and university must expand its focus to study the issue, abandoning some narrow views of inequality and understanding the nature of income distribution and growth and many other things. We have also learned that it must be domestic experts who lead local projects to combat inequality, that this is a global effort that must be very collective. We have learned also that COVID accelerated the trend of inequality around the world that we were already in evidence in years ago. And many other things, that there is a community and local dimension to challenge inequality that is indispensable, that governments must confront with all its tools, exclusion, racism, or xenophobia to assure the development of all. Multilateralism is essential and will be the access, and the access of technology will be very relevant as the access to public goods to solve this situation. And our answer to inequality will be a test of whether we have learned anything from this crisis and the previous crisis of 2008, and many other things. Our commitment after these seminars is to make inequality a central focus in all the areas of our work at the university. We want to be part of global networks that study and combat the inequality around the world. And we will do our best to present soon some advances and results of this commitment in research on inequality. Your ideas have been very inspiring today, and we will keep them in mind for our immediate work. And also, future is compromised by double standards in the response to COVID and the limitations that we perceive in the solidarity expressed towards the more vulnerable. We also take from this seminar and the others some hope with us, because some things are changing for the better. and will enable the conversation that we need for the future. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, especially the speakers, also our students, and for all of you who via WebEx or YouTube have participated in this dialogue. Thank you very much.